welcome to tonight's GlobalNet 21 webinar, which takes the form of what I've called a curated conversation, for want of a better term, a discussion between myself, Terry Loane, and Bryan Alexander. And the overall topic of the discussion is making education fit for purpose. And the discussion will probably last around about half an hour. I'm so old that I'm still actually quite excited and thrilled in a way by the fact that it's possible to have a synchronous conversation with myself in the outskirts of London and with Bryan Alexander, who is in the outskirts of Washington, DC. And, this is something completely new, which would not have been possible at any earlier time in my life. And I think it's particularly important, actually, if we're going to be discussing education, to make such links. Because it seems to me that there are very different educational traditions and very different educational assumptions if you compare one country with another. And I feel that we can all learn by looking at what happens in other countries. Because, well, one of the themes I'd like to explore this evening with you, Bryan, is the idea of trying to step outside the assumptions that everybody makes with education. You see, the overall question really for tonight, the overriding question, I think, is what would a fit-for-purpose 21st century education look like? And the second part of the question, which I think is equally important but very difficult, how in practical terms can we move towards this vision of a fit-for-purpose system? But rather than addressing that question head-on, Bryan, I'd like to just start by talking a bit more about these assumptions. And if I start from my point of view in the UK, I really want to look at what I see as a sort of conflict that whenever I talk to people about education, they're very dissatisfied with it. Parents, young people, teachers and academics, but people don't seem to step outside those assumptions. I'll just park that for a moment, because I think what we ought to do is to each introduce ourselves briefly by saying a little bit about our educational background and our particular interests. So if I could invite you, first of all, Bryan, just to introduce yourself briefly.
Well, it's always a guaranteed win to ask an educator about their educational experience. They're just guaranteed to talk. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. And thank you both, and thank you to all participants for participating. I really appreciate the chance. And I don't think, Terry, that it is a question of age that makes this seem miraculous. It's a question of experience with technology that makes this seem miraculous. We have the technology, but in practical reality, it doesn't always work. So I'm delighted that this works right now. My educational background is primary and secondary school through what in the US we call public school. So that's locally funded, state regulated primary and secondary schools. For my undergraduate and my PhD, I went to the University of Michigan, which is a public university that is mostly funded by the state of Michigan. And from there, I've been a professor of English literature. I have helped run a nonprofit. And on the side, I teach some classes at Georgetown University.
Thanks very much, Bryan. My experience in education is quite broad. I sometimes think I've been a sort of educational odd job man. I've actually taught at every age from preschool 3 to 4-year-olds through to 80-year-olds who were learning how to use the internet. We used to call them silver surfers. And although I'm retired from full-time work now, I maintain a very strong interest in education. And I think what I bring from this quite wide experience I've had is I look at things that have worked successfully outside the school system, and I think, can we bring those into schools? And that takes me straight back, really, to the idea of educational assumptions. Because certainly on this side of the Atlantic, as I hinted earlier, many people, in fact, almost everybody to whom I talk is unhappy about what's going on in education at the moment.
Yes.
And I would suggest that they're increasingly unhappy. But then they seem to find it very difficult to step outside the assumptions. And those assumptions include things like the fact that, well, the fact of the school year. Here in the UK, the standard school year is 190 days, which means that schools are locked shut for almost half the year. And that seems to me to be odd. It seems to me to be equally odd to assume that all the 12-year-olds should learn together and all the 13-year-olds should learn together. It seems to me to be equally odd to assume that young people, particularly teenagers, should learn between the hours of 9 and 4 o'clock, when we all know that teenagers, it's a particular stage in your life when you don't like getting out of bed. So why not extend the educational possibilities into evenings and weekends? But these questioning of the assumptions just don't seem to happen. And I wonder if your experience is similar on the other side of the Atlantic, Bryan.
My experience is identical. People often have a vision of education that was cutting edge circa 1920. There are exceptions, but most of the discourse around education occurs at that kind of retro level. Recently, the US made a huge push into standardized testing at large scales. So that's a little bit more modern. If you accept, say, the medieval Chinese idea of Gaokuo is modern, and that's been usually considered to be a failure. Most parents, most adults, all children are against it, and the system is probably on its last legs. There is a great deal of innovation and creative ferment in primary and secondary school in the US. Everything from project-based learning to teaching about and with robots to multimedia work, but that usually doesn't get a lot of press and doesn't get a lot of attention. Partly because it's usually not at scale. Usually it's a matter of an individual classroom or a teacher. Post-secondary experience, our colleges and universities, are a real mix. We have an awful lot of creativity, a lot of creative churn going on. But I think we often have a problematic relationship with the outside world. I agree with you, Terry. It's terrific to look at the rest of a given society and see what you can learn about pedagogy and institutional support from it. But we are, in many ways, over the past 30 years, the U.S. privatized public higher education and turned more and more the financing of it over to loans rather than to state support. And as a result, there seems to be a closer relationship between universities and business, but that's politically very, very fraught. And some sectors have a hard time managing that, to put it briefly. I think we still deal with the ivory tower idea of education as a conserving place, as a place to hold on to maintain. And there's a lot of wonderful power to that. You think of academic libraries maintaining the world's cultural, intellectual heritage. There's a glory to that. But at the same time, it can make us too stable and not flexible enough. I have many experiences where I ask audiences to think about the future or to think about the present, and I do this in different ways. And all too often it's revealed that my academic audiences think of the present as something akin to 1975. I mean that quite literally. Their understanding of demographics is from 1975. Their understanding of student loans is from 1975. And we really have to get out of it. We really have to think about 2075.
In the interview that you did, I think last month with GlobalNet 21, and I hope I'm quoting you correctly here, Bryan, but I think you said, you talked about educational technology replicating analog practices in a digital world.
Yes.
And that seems to me to relate to what you've just said about people imagining from the educational point of view that we're living back in the 1970s. And could you just say a bit more about how, about what you mean by this and how you think the digital world can get away from just mimicking the analog world in a slightly faster way, if I can put it like that. How could we actually use, how could digital technology be used to really fundamentally change education and make it fit for purpose in the contemporary world?
In a whole series of ways. What we're doing right now, for example, in a sense, violates a classroom norm. The old idea of the classroom is a physical space where a door is closed, and that prevents the outside world from impinging on the face-to-face class. And you know that there are a lot of benefits to that, a lot of good reasons. But the reality of the present world is that those doors no longer exist. They've been blown wide open, and we have many, many flows going in and out of the classroom. And so that if I'm in fourth grade or if I am a law student, I should be able to collaborate with people on a project, and those people should be able to be located anywhere on Earth. I should seek feedback from people in multiple nations, multiple ages, all kinds of nationalities, ethnicities, religions. That's the condition of work. That's the condition of life today. And so we should be able to breach that boundary. I mean, that's one way. You mentioned scheduling and time. This is the other way, which is quite strange, that we hold on to the past. We think about the schedule, as you said, that, what was it, 182 days a year?
It's well, the standard school year in this country is 190 days, which mean there are 175 days when they're just locked shut.
My apologies to the legions of British students. I just condemned an extra week of class. Yeah, I think, you know, there's nothing about learning that we know of that dictates that schedule, especially not the time frame in a given day. If we look at teenagers, we know that having them learn and do academic work at 7:30 in the morning is laughable. But instead, if we can reschedule, reformat education to a much higher level, I'll give you one example as a story. This is a little bit of American culture. I was speaking with an online academy. So this is an institution's classes are entirely online. They were presenting about their work, and they described that they had launched a web page that was a welcome to this university. I'd like to learn classes through you kind of page. And they did some data analytics and checked when that page got the largest number of hits. And they asked an audience of academics, when do you think those dates were? And the academics, thinking of academic calendars, said, oh, late August, early September, i.e. when fall classes begin. No, that wasn't it. So maybe it was January 1st, the beginning of the new academic year. No, that wasn't it. Overwhelmingly, the two largest dates were the days after Christmas and the day after Thanksgiving. Those are holidays and times when you had adults who were trapped in close rooms with their family members and shamed or inspired into wanting to improve their lives. And every time they got the website was hit on late November, late December, the response they gave back to these would-be learners was, thank you for your interest, but we are closed for the next week. And then the head of the academy said, well, this is stupid. I mean, what if we had something to give them right away? What if we had that whole curriculum to roll out on the spot? And so they did that. They revised it. It took some work. But that wasn't the idea, was to meet learners where they actually learn and when they actually learn. I mean, if we can do that, we have to reformat, like a bad disk drive, all of the scheduling and logistics of primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And those are two ways. We can go even further still. You know, think, Terry, if I take a class from you in, say, French, which would be good because my French is very bad right now.
So is mine.
Oh, merveilleux. So if well, we give a race to the bottom, but we can use new media in that class. That is, you could use 3D printing to print out the Eiffel Tower. That's always fun. I can search online to find examples of French culture in images, and you could show us videos of people speaking French, which is very instructive. And that's all useful, and that costs nothing, which is nice. But what if we go further? What if you ask me and my other poor students to make a curriculum What if you ask us to build websites and to build content describing what we already know and use that as a framework to describe where we have to go further still based on, say, Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development?
Yes.
And what if instead you relied on tutoring software like, say, Duolingo, and had us use that to practice our vocabulary and our grammar while you reserved the class time for much more high-level, intellectually challenging things such as discussing French culture or helping individual students with individual cases and so on. I mean, we can just use the technology to start unpicking all the assumptions of class and produce something quite different and much more responsive to the very purpose of learning.
Yes, it's interesting that you use languages as an example there, because I'm a keen language learner, and it just seems, I'm not a language teacher obviously, but I'm a keen language learner, and it seems to me that technology can transform that, and as you say, Bryan, it can enable the classroom, when people do physically get together, to be devoted to much more valuable and value-adding tasks than just going through the stuff that people can better do by themselves. Now, I did mention it earlier, but the first half of my career really was involved in music education. And again, I think there are, certainly from the way we have successfully done music in this country, there are things that schools can learn, because for 5 or 6 years of that time, I managed what we called a Saturday morning music centre. And every week I used to look and think, why have these 400 young people come here? Nobody makes them come here, so they must quite like it. And of course, we did that outside of the school week. Cool. We did it on Saturday morning. There were certain activities that took place in the evenings. And another big tradition in this country in terms of music is the holiday course. So you talked about people being enthusiastic about learning the day after Christmas. Well, very often 2 days after Christmas, young people would go off to a residential place with a band or an orchestra or a choir and make music for a week. So I do think that this model of using what has traditionally been the downtime and at the same time using it flexibly, because nobody's forced to join a particular band or orchestra, or nobody's forced to do music. They might like to spend the week after Christmas doing coding. And it seems to me that this sort of hugely successful flexibility is something that we could perhaps make more mainstream. I wonder what you think of that, Bryan, whether that relates to your experience in the States.
Well, I can think that I did not teach music. However, I did, in a fairly middling way, try playing the cello from age 7, I think, through age 18. And so I can think fondly of many great summer and weekend experiences in orchestras. And as a result, my lifelong devotion to Dvorak and my resentment of Mozart. I think we can do this right away. I know in Ireland there is a almost mandatory gap year between high school and college. And in the US, this is starting to become culturally accepted, especially as our lifespans extend. Building in a zone of possibility where one can work at a job, or one can volunteer, or one can teach oneself French. Okay, go to Paris and learn that. Or teach yourself coding. I think there's a lot to be said for that, and that's much easier to accomplish right now. The downtime we are already seeing happening at the micro and informal levels. I mentioned Duolingo, for example. So I will often check my Spanish lessons when I'm standing in line at the drugstore, or when I'm on a long train ride. These little downtimes that I feel with other ways too, with reading, with contemplation, but to sneak in learning then, I think is something that's happening. And we see that by informal learning. I don't just refer to the fact that I'm learning Spanish on my own, but also we think about cases when people want to repair their yard, So they go to YouTube and find out ways of digging, and they find blueprints on the web of the area. They go to Pinterest for inspiration. Maybe they look at Netflix and look at Downton Abbey to be exalted. But these are all ways of just fitting and learning on the fly as part of our lives. I mean, what we're describing, the academic calendar, the academic day, is, I think, increasingly an artifact that is heading into the rearview mirror. But this is there are obstacles to this. I mean, one huge obstacle is inertia, and the inertia is often very, very well established. But this can also be put in place politically. In the U.S., we have in K through 12, we have teachers unions who have some power depending on where they are. But we also have state bureaucracies and local bureaucracies which are designed to maintain the status quo. In higher education, we have a different problem. We are suffering from an enrollment downturn and many financial challenges, both of which are going to get worse over the next decade. So that's causing many universities to hedge themselves in, to retrench, and double down on what they're currently doing rather than experiment. So we're actually seeing cuts rather than expansions, reductions rather than growth. So I hope through conversations like this that we can show ways for educators to think beyond that. But it is definitely a struggle.
Well, we won't get into a discussion of the relative merits of Mozart and Dvorak. We'll leave that to another webinar.
Okay, if you insist.
Actually, just a little musical anecdote, but I think it says something profound about our changing relationship with knowledge. I was recently playing a Steinway grand piano, the best piano in the world, at the City Lit, which is the big adult college in London, and I dropped the pencil down behind the keys. And I was very embarrassed. I thought this could damage the whole piano.
Yes.
And then I discovered, just by going into YouTube, somebody has made a video about how to get the pencil out of a Steinway grand piano when it goes down behind the keys. And you see, and this meant that the college was able to fix the problem without paying goodness knows how much for a technician. Now, it's a silly story, but it says something about the instant availability of information and knowledge.
Yes.
And sticking with music, a great friend of mine has just retired as a music teacher. He taught music at what we call A level, in other words, to 16 to 18-year-olds. He said, I don't know how I ever did the job before YouTube, because now I can ask them to listen to any piece of music and they can access it. So what, again, perhaps this comes back to the question of replicating analog practices, or moving beyond replicating analog practices. And maybe we should now, as we're getting towards the end, move back to the fundamental question, namely, how do we make education fit for purpose in this digital age? Or what would it look like, and how do we get there? So just concentrating on this, what I see as a revolutionary change in the relationship between human beings and knowledge. How will that impact on what education should look like, do you think, Bryan?
Well, right now, as you described, we have the semi-realized vision of always-on learning, access to content, but also access to experts. I'm teaching a seminar next month on emerging technologies for education, and I'm struggling with which book to assign. So I quickly put out a request for this across Twitter, across my blog, LinkedIn, and now I have a bibliography of about 35 books, which is a wonderful thing to see, all generated by experts who are thinking of this in different levels. So we have that access, which in many ways should shift our teaching away from fact mastery and towards skill, towards practice, towards reflection. And I think that's underway with some trends, both informal learning, but also informal learning with the use of the flipped classroom. This is something which we need to rely on more, but then it branches off into two other further directions that are more challenging. One of them is that when you were describing the Steinway story, I thought you were going to say that video was actually a live video of someone filming you as you did it, right? And one of the things that we have to embrace, which is difficult, is that we are publishers, we are creators in ways that the education system wasn't really designed to support. I mean, students have always made things. I mean, when you were a child, you made a performance, a recital. You know, we wrote papers, we completed quizzes and so on, but those were ephemeral, usually, unrecorded or quickly lost. But now, conceivably, anything a student can do can be recorded, reproduced, published, shared. Students are, in effect, producers. And if we rethink that, then we rethink quite a bit of what we do. That pushes us more towards project-based learning, for example. That makes us rethink intellectual property of students or copyright holders, which is, I think, very exciting. It makes us think about how we celebrate students and their work. But it also changes, the kinds of assignments we give them when we have them make things. So to have a student perform a recital is fantastic. But think about what the other students can learn who get to record this. What they learn about acoustics, for example, what they learn about space and volume, as well as carpentry and interior design. Then the bells and whistles of learning how to record and how to publish a recording. That's non-trivial. To go further, faculty and staff get to make more and more and to share more and more content. I mean, this is one of the great uses of Twitter right now, is teachers sharing their class experiences with other teachers around the world. It's really one of the great professional development successes of our time. So, on the one hand, let's push further on producers, as students as makers, students as creators. That's very, very exciting, and at least it's some really subversive pedagogies in the end. But alongside that, we have to think about what this means digitally. We are making so much data. It's truly extraordinary. A friend of mine teaches meteorology, and he's one of those wonderful, wonderful, gifted professors who, after generations of teaching the same topic, is still in love with it and can inspire students in that love. But he's also a scientist. So these are large classes, 200 student classes he teaches every year. And he now tells me he has so much data about his students that with 90% accuracy, he can predict if a student will pass or fail his class within 1 week of the class beginning. Think about this. I mean, he's someone who loves teaching. So if he can identify the students who are likely to fail, he can then have conversations with them. Suggest maybe they take it the next year, point them to resources, that kind of thing. But imagine if that professor has that in play, and I'm teaching down the hall and I don't have that in play. Is my class now inferior? Would a parent who is spending money to send their child to these classes, would they feel that, this Alexander guy has to catch up? He's teaching in an antediluvian way. Do we have to support this? But we go still further. I mean, there are many examples of people using data analytics to improve retention, to improve class success. I was just working with last week with a group who have these wonderful adaptive learning projects, which they claim reduce the number of students failing a college math class by 30%, which is a huge, huge step forward. And we have this data, which then leads to other problems. It leads to problems of privacy, leads to problems of abuse. So we have to deal with that and think hard about that. We have to wonder, what does it mean to own your data? So if I'm a student entering secondary school, heading towards A levels, what does it mean that I make data as I check out books in the library, as I take exams? Who owns that? What does it mean for civil rights? Go still further still. Go further on. One of the reasons I mentioned Duolingo is because Duolingo has a very basic AI built in, a very, very basic one. It's one that can see how you're doing in a language. It can figure out the words that you're very good at and not keep repeating them at you in quizzes. It can find the verbs that you're having a hard time with, and it can push this forward towards you and really train you and really work on you like a good basic tutor can. If we can have that kind of AI based on that kind of information, think about applying that to other domains. So to have a Duolingo for math, a Duolingo for history, not interpretations, but the basic facts of history, a Duolingo for chemistry, and so on, even for classical music or at least music appreciation. I mean, that's something we can code right now, this year, and roll out. That's not a problem. And then these become stronger over time as we can train AIs. I mean, so we have to think about how this works. Does it mean that we replace some human instructors with AI tutors? We might, for various reasons, good and bad. Does it mean we change pedagogy? So again, do we shift the classroom experience around so that I just do in the classroom what the AI cannot do? That's a lot of retraining and rethinking. And ultimately, that should be a very powerful, improved learning experience for students. I think the whole question of data is one that we're just wading into right now. And it's one which can transform education if we do it right.
So we've talked, Bryan, and we're getting towards the end now. We've talked about, if I try to sum up, flexibility, increasing flexibility. We've talked about increasing creativity, and I really liked your emphasis on learning through doing what I call authentic tasks. So rather than doing exercises, you do something real.
Yes.
And we've talked about the benefits, but also the dangers of using data to refine the teaching process. But maybe one final question, and I think if there was time, we could go on for a long time, but one final question. If we are going to have a more flexible, more creative, and more intelligent ways of learning, how do we actually get from where we are now towards that? What steps can we as educators or citizens do to move us there? Because I do think that's a difficult question.
The key factor is that we have to reintroduce imagination to the entire educational enterprise. That's very difficult because we are very stuck on metrics. For example, in Britain, in higher education, you have two enormous sets of metrics, the research educational framework and now the teaching educational framework. And that drills down into very, very precise quantifiable data that reifies all kinds of structures. We have to remember that education is above all the domain of the imagination. That's how we learn, by stretching that imagination, by incorporating new ideas. I think we need to think harder about the future. We have to become futurists in order to really practice this. The second thing is, I think we have to be better about, well, for a more incendiary term, classroom democracy. We have to be better at listening to students and hearing students. The world of a 15-year-old is enormously different than the world of a 55-year-old. And I say that in part, I'm 52 myself. My children are in their early 20s. It's clear that we're aliens to each other, at least in our experience. And perhaps more so than previous generational gaps have demonstrated. But we need to listen hard to what their sense of the world is and what they need and what they experience. I mean, their experience with digital technology can be flawed, partial, incomplete, but I think in many ways they have an awful lot of experience to share with us. A third, I think, is we have to really empower our instructional staff. We have to empower teachers and professors, lecturers, and instructional staff at all levels to really take risks and try new things. We have to do this at scale. We have to let them collaborate across institutions, across geographical boundaries, so that they can really try things out. Going online is a fantastic way to do that. They can pair up with scholars and instructors all over the world who are all thinking about these very same things. A scholar in Japan has very different challenges in some ways, yet very similar ones. They too are facing the question of obsolescence, of how to shift to a service and knowledge-based economy, how to deal with demographics of aging. We can learn a great deal from this. I mean, we really need to just put everything on the table, shake it up, think imaginatively, and collaborate until it hurts so that we can build something new, different, and better. That's a very kind of cliched finale for a poor answer to your very good question.
No, I think it was an excellent answer. We do have to finish now, and I really will go away with one of your final phrases there, Bryan. We have to collaborate till it hurts, because I do think there's something very much in that. May I just thank you again, Bryan, and say how moving in a way it has been to have this transatlantic conversation about something we both feel very strongly about, education and educational change. And I hope we'll have the opportunity for another transatlantic conversation again in the future. Thank you very much indeed, Bryan.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
you.